Welcome, everyone. My name is Allison Scheifele. I am the director of the Community Health Training Institute. I'm so excited to have you here with us today for this training. So we are here for navigating local policy to advance community and change, which is brought to you in partnership between the Massachusetts Department of Public Health and Health Resources in Action. And again, we're here through the Community Health Training Institute. Lots of different organizations behind this. We are excited to bring you this free training, and we hope that you will leave with better understanding of how to increase your effectiveness and impact within the community. And for those who might need to leave the training early today, please let my colleague Victoria Nemeth know so that she can send the training evaluation link, and we will make sure everyone gets that. Please fill it out. We really do look at them all and help get the feedback for this training, but it will determine our training calendar moving forward. So always excited to have folks here, love doing these trainings, and we are so excited to have Janeska here to lead this training for us. And so I will hand it right on over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Please bear with me while I attempt to share my screen. All right, can everyone see my screen? All right, awesome. Well, good morning. Again, I'm so grateful to be in this space with y'all. My name is Janeska Romang. I'm with the Mass Public Health Alliance, and we are a small nonprofit policy advocacy organization that works to promote the building blocks of good health through policy advocacy, coalition building, and community power building. So before we jump into the training, would love to spend some time with an icebreaker. We often joke at MPHA that our love language is icebreakers because we include them in every single thing that we do. So why don't we go around in the chat and please share about a time you used your voice to get something that you wanted. It doesn't have to be policy related or like cause related, and it can be something big or small. So I'll pause here, and I encourage folks to drop their stories into the chat, and then we'll spend some time at the end seeing if there's maybe one or two volunteers to share their story. Right, no need to be shy. And now that we've sufficiently thawed from our icebreaker, wanted to give a overview of how our time together is going to look like. So over the next 3 hours or so, we're going to develop a foundational understanding of how can you impact change through the legislature, including when the best times are for advocacy and best practices around lobbying and advocacy. We'll also talk about how to affect change through the state budget process. And then from there, in like the last third of the training, we'll apply what you've learned so you can confidently advocate for budget items in the FY26 budget. So before we jump in, a couple of things that I wanted to note. We want this training to be interactive. So as we go through, there's going to be opportunities to engage by either throwing things into the chat, using Zoom reactions or emojis, and there will be breakout activities to put some of the things that we learned into practice. And then I also wanted to flag that we do have a lot of ground to cover. So as we go through, if there's any specific questions that you might have about a slide, please feel free to drop that into the chat or to raise your hand. Our partners at HRA are going to be monitoring and will be flagging for me as like questions come up. Because I'll be sharing my screen and won't be able to see everyone's lovely faces. And then lastly, wanted to recognize that this is a long training. So throughout, please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Feel free to eat on camera, to get up to drink water, to stay hydrated. And I wanted to flag that midway through, we will have an opportunity to break, to stretch our legs, and then come back together for the second half refreshed. So with that, let's jump in with the legislative structure. So over the next few slides, we're going to delve into the legislative structure, power dynamics, and who controls the levers of change. But before I move on to the next slide, I'd love to hear from y'all why you think the legislature is important. So please feel free to drop things into the chat, or if you want to chime in with a thought, please feel free to come off mute and share your thoughts. We'll take 1 or 2 people, and I'll be monitoring the chat for folks' reactions. Again, why do you think that the legislature is important? Again, there's wrong.
Maybe, hi again. I think just looking at any current political climate gives folks an idea of why the legislation, all, Congress, the House, the whole process is important because funding and values and all of the things that we're seeing are part of the process and get played out through the process.
Thank you. That's exactly right. The legislature holds a lot of power, and they get to decide how we're going to invest in different programs, how policies or like how bills advance through the legislative process, and even how we as a state interact with the federal landscape. So those are all really great reasons. And over the next slide, we're going to get into kind of more into the nitty-gritty of what the legislature does. All right, so this is another interactive activity. I'm going to read through the statements that describe the legislature. And if you think that they're correct, then put the number into the chat and put all the numbers into the chat that you think are correct. So to get us started, 1, the legislature discusses and votes on proposed state laws. 2, the legislature decides who will be governor every 4 years. 3, the legislature is made up of 40 senators and 160 reps. 4, the legislature has 3 parts: the House, the Senate, and the streets. 5, people can ask their legislator for help with things in the community. 6, the legislature determines how we spend state tax dollars every single year. 7, your congressperson and your state legislator are the same person. And 8, state legislators run for office every 3 years. So I'll pause here, and I encourage folks to drop the numbers into the chat that you think are correct. And don't worry about any wrong or right answers. We're going to spend some time in the next slide going through. So if you can, just drop your guesses into the chat. All right, Wendy, thank you. I'm seeing 1, 3, 6, and 8. Does anyone else agree or have others? Okay, awesome. I'm seeing, again, a lot of the same numbers. I'm seeing 5 also thrown into the mix. 1, 3, and 6. Okay, I'll give folks another second or 2 to drop in their guesses before I reveal our answers. Awesome. Okay, 1, 3, 5, 6. I'm seeing Chris add all. Cool, cool, cool. And Lori, we're going to go over the responses in the next slide. So right now, if you just want to drop your guesses about which statements are true, you can put that into the chat, and then I'll reveal our answers in the next slide. All right, awesome. I appreciate everyone putting in their guesses into the chat. It looks like there are a lot of pros in the training. So just quickly, the 1, 3, 5, 6 are all correct. And then the ones that are highlighted and bolded in like the burnt orange were updated to become correct statements. So starting off with number 1, the legislature has the power to make decisions that impact the world around us, from laws to the annual budget, establishing courts and oversight over state agencies like the Executive Office of Health and Human Services, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Streets. And the legislature also has the power to override a governor's veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers, so in the House and in the Senate. Number 2, registered voters decide who the governor will be every 4 years. So the people have the power. Every 4 years, registered voters from across the Commonwealth come together and we elect our governor. Number 3, the legislature is made up of 2 parts. The House, which is comprised of 160 representatives, and the Senate, which is comprised of 40 senators. And then number 4, the legislature is made up of 2 parts. Theoretically, the streets in their districts they represent, but when we're looking at the breakdown, it's the House and the Senate. Number 5, people can ask their legislators for help with things in the community. This is true. Legislators are generalists and they rely on constituents like you, not only to stay up to date with their issues, but also to inform solutions both locally and statewide. And here in Massachusetts, we're really fortunate in that we have more opportunities to meet and connect with our legislators. Many states only have a 1-year session, and here in Massachusetts, we have access to our legislators all year round in a 2-year session. And that gives us opportunities to build relationships with legislators and their staff to influence the process, both at the local level and at the state level. All right, number 5 is true. The legislature debates every year the state budget, and they determine how we spend our tax dollars. So whereas the legislature takes up and passes bills in a 2-year cycle, they determine how we spend our state dollars annually. And once a year, each chamber will have the opportunity to draft their proposal for the state budget as part of the state budget process. And that's something I'm going to put a pin in for now. And we'll spend a little bit more time later on in the training, kind of getting into the weeds of the process and how we can influence change. All right, number 7, your congressperson and your state legislator are different. A congressperson is elected to federal office and often makes policy decisions that impact the entire country, whereas a state rep or state senator, they advocate on like state level policies. And last but not least, legislators run for office every 2 years. So it's the term is 2 years. However, there is no term limit. That's why there are a lot of people that can serve for a decade or span multiple terms. And right now there are many career legislators that are retiring, and there are seats that are up for grabs across the state. So that's why local elections are really, really important, because they determine who comes next and how they'll help shape policies that continue moving us toward a healthier, more just Commonwealth. Alrighty. So thank you all for playing the trivia with me. Would love to hear what y'all have contacted your legislators about. So some of you responded in the pre-survey that you feel somewhat comfortable speaking to legislators, while others not so much. And we also saw a wide variety of issues that you care about, from food access to mental health to local public health. So I just wanted to give a moment here for some of you to raise your hand or enter into the chat something that you've contacted your legislator about, and then we can kind of we'll use that to kind of catapult us into the next section and build off of this in some of our breakout activities that are coming on further down the workshop. So I'll pause here and I'll have folks drop things into the chat. What are some things that you've contacted your legislators about? It can be about a local issue, a statewide issue. Would love to hear folks' examples in the chat. Or if you feel so inclined, come off mute and share it with the group. All right, Lori. Seeing advocated about water protections. PFAS are forever chemicals that impact Fort Devens soil and groundwater contamination. I'm seeing that Jason has advocated around HIP with the HIP benefits, which is around healthy food access. Angela supporting overdose prevention centers and harm reduction. And Jackie reach out to vouch for guaranteed income in our cities for low-income families. Awesome. These are all great examples of, I'd love to hear all the things that y'all have taken action on, and we will come back to these different issue areas as we practice further on how to talk with our legislators and what goes into good messaging, good compelling messaging. So thank you all for sharing your examples. All right. Now, in thinking about who holds power in the legislature. So we often hear that the State House is described as a high school with varying cliques that have power and influence over other members. So that's why we've included a photo from the popular movie Mean Girls to represent some of those dynamics. So in thinking about who holds power in the State House, we think about it in 4 different buckets: House leadership, Senate leadership, committee chairs, and you. So the Speaker of the House, thinking about House leadership, presides over the House of Representatives. The Speaker is also the chief leader and controls the flow of legislation. Then turning our attention to the Senate, then Senate leadership, the Senate President presides over the Senate, sets the agenda and priorities for the session calendar of legislation to be considered, interprets rules, and preserves order and decorum in the chamber. Committee chairs. Committee chairs hold a lot of power. Committees are comprised of senators and representatives, and a chair is appointed from each chamber. So chambers get to decide what bills will be taken up, when there will be hearings on specific issues like bills on PFAS, on HIP, on overdose prevention centers, and they get to decide if the bill gets to move forward in the bill making process. And lastly, in the 4th bucket, we see the constituent as being within the power structure. We as constituents have a ton of power because we vote folks in and out of office. We're experts in the community and issue areas. And most importantly, we can tap into our power by organizing in numbers. And again, as a reminder, legislators are generalists and they need people like you and like I to share our perspectives, because without that, they're not like tapped into what's happening to the community. And they want to hear from us to help shape the programs and policies that impact our neighborhoods, our communities, and the communities that we work with. All righty, committees and power. So I just touched on the kind of the makeup of committees. And here's an example of some committees that would be relevant to some of the issues that y'all are really interested in. Again, there are tons of committees that that come together and hear bills. Right now in the legislative process, bills have been filed and now committee assignments have been given. So now we have committee chairs for all of our joint committees. So now they're in the process of deciding which bills go to which committees, and then they'll be responsible for creating the calendar of when bills will be heard. In thinking about committees, not all committees are created equally. For example, the Committee on Ways and Means is one of the most powerful committees in the State House. They're super powerful because they lead on the budget. Every year, the House and the Senate has the opportunity to kind of draft their proposal of the state budget, meaning they get to decide, they get to propose how we invest in different programs like HIP, like SNAP, like RAFT, like EA Shelter. And they often are like a midway stop or last stop for a bill becoming a law. So basically, any bill wanting to advance through the process will at some point need to stop in the Ways and Means Committee before it can progress to get onto the governor's desk. And for this reason, it's really important to interact with the Joint Committee on Ways and Means, with the chairs, to let them know of our priorities, what we're seeing on the ground, and to influence the legislative process, because they do hold a lot of power. Alrighty. So next up, we're going to get ready for our first breakout room exercise. So we're going to spend some time getting to know our legislators a little bit better. So in our breakout groups, in pairs or groups of 2 or 3, we're going to spend some time finding our legislator. And if you don't know, that's totally okay. To find your state rep or senator, you can click on the link and we'll put that into the chat shortly. I'm going to just walk us through the example. Once you click on the link, it'll take you to this page on the legislature's website, and you can enter your address. I'm just using my work address for right now. And once you search, it'll give you both your representative and your senator. So in your small groups, pick one. And then you can, when you go onto their main page, you can see all of the bills that they've either filed or co-sponsored. That is here. These are all the bills that they've sponsored. You can see the bills that they've co-sponsored, as well as the committees they're on, their biography, and their district. So we'll spend some time in small groups finding our legislators. And then in your small group, would love for you to answer these questions about your legislators. So 1, what is their career background? What are 2 bills that they recently sponsored and how long they've been in office? I'll drop all of this into the chat so you'll have this, and we'll be in small groups for about 7 minutes, and then we'll come back together and hopefully hear some report outs of, some interesting things that you found out about your legislators, or like bills that they've sponsored. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone. I'll pause and see if folks have any questions before we go into breakout rooms. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you had a moment to connect with folks in the breakout groups, and able to find really interesting stuff on your legislators. So would love to pause here and then encourage folks to come off mute. Maybe 1 or 2 people can volunteer to share a little bit about what they found about their legislators with the group. Lori?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty crazy, the length of the bills that my senator is sponsoring, and none of them were specific to my main issue right now, the PFAS bills. But it's hard to figure out what he is focusing on. There's so much, and there's just so much information in that website on the top with the tabs and the dates and the definition of laws, and it's overwhelming.
For sure. Lori, can you share who your representative or senator was?
Eldridge, Jamie Eldridge.
Jamie Eldridge. Okay. Yeah. And I totally hear you about it feeling very overwhelming on the legislature. I think in one part, it's good to have, so much information centralized in one way. But it can feel a little bit daunting at times. But I think one of the things that is helpful about having the list of bills that legislators co-sponsor or sponsor, it helps us see what kind of issues they're working on. And at a glance, they're not working on PFAS. So that presents an opportunity to then approach them and say, hey, I noticed you endorsed or sponsored all these different bills, and maybe there's a way to find a connection to like a bridge, right, from a bill that they're sponsoring or co-sponsoring and making that connection to PFAS. It's also a really great way for accountability, right? Like everything is there. So like if they're like, I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna support, and you see that they haven't co-sponsored, it gives us a tool to check in real time and then follow up. Which can be really helpful, especially like when we get into the swing of things and we're doing outreach and there are like hearings and testimony. That's a great like accountability piece when we're having those one-on-one with legislators or their staff.
Yeah.
Thank you again for sharing, Lori. Chris, I see you raising your hand. You want to jump in?
Yeah, I found out who my people are is Colleen Gary and Edwards J. Kennedy. I've seen them both collaborating together, and I was there was a lot there. I'm gonna have to go back to that website and kind of really get into what they are combining with, because I know for me, I am a person with a physical disability and I have spina bifida, and my issues are getting around the community safely, because I lived in a town that I had trouble getting on a local transportation bus because there was a graveled area and the area just was not safe for me to go from one side of the street to the area without a sidewalk. So I was able to encourage the town to put a sidewalk in the stretch that I lived in at one point, which I felt very accomplished in doing. So that was one of my other things I wanted to kind of comment on, elaborate on with the comment I made earlier when you were first asking. So I'm going to have to really go back to see what these two folks are collaborating about and see if I can find something to interject there, because the town I live in right now, they really don't have sidewalks because it's a farming area type situation. It's an older farm area. So
Chris, thank you so much for sharing. I think your example of how like you were able to get that win and securing sidewalks in your town is really powerful and shows it is a testament to like what can happen when we raise our voice, right? And like the importance of really reaching out and following up with legislators to like get solutions implemented locally and statewide. That has an impact on like statewide policies that are passed and investments in statewide programs.
yeah, well, like I said, I lived in a local town, and I went to the city hall and found out who I needed to talk to through city hall to be able to get my safety concerns raised, because being in a wheelchair and having to go on the side of the street, I was afraid that somebody was going to hit me. I have been hit a couple times in my wheelchair.
Wow.
Due to a driver not paying attention, and it didn't help that I hid between two trash cans, but still, I got revenge on them by one of their tires had gotten a flat tire because they hit a certain part of my chair and it was a sharp edge and it nicked their wheel and gave them a flat. So that's just my experience. I'm sorry if I hope it was on the right wavelength as we're on right now.
It 100% is, and I'm so grateful for you for your advocacy and for you sharing your experience. Again, I think this highlights why we need to be raising our voices and like how we are like we're experts in our community of what needs to get done and also the solutions. And I think given like the fact that you've approached city council, city hall, your state legislators, and have some experience like in advocacy, I will be tapping on you later on as we practice like what goes into compelling testimony or like how to tell our story effectively. So we kind of get at the head and the heart, which is makes our messaging really sticky to like encourage legislators to move in the way that we want them to, right? And be responsive to our needs.
I'll be glad to tell my little advocacy comments of how I am able to advocate for myself to be able to get things. And I was actually just on the phone earlier with a wheelchair company trying to get a part replaced on my bed because of my disability. So it's really important.
I hear you and appreciate you, Chris. I'm gonna hold you to it. Further down the workshop, we'll get into the like how to talk to your legislators into like message construction. So I will be circling back so we can share some examples. And again, really appreciate you sharing your experience with the group. And I think it like perfectly illustrates like the power of advocacy and raising your voice. I do want to flag a question that Lori put into the chat about contacting someone who is not your elected official, but whom you want to push to support. Does that have no impacts? Do you really need to find supporters within the district? So I am going to put this in the bike rack because we are going to talk about that later on. But quickly, what I'll say is like going back to the slide of who holds power. That really comes into play, right? And also it matters like where we are in the legislative cycle. So right now, and really throughout the legislative process, it's really important to build a relationship with your state legislator, both in the House and the Senate. But then there are opportunities as bills get heard, right? So I can give an example of, let's say RTAs, Regional Transit Authority, because transit is top of mind now, given the example. The RTA advancement bill, for example, is in the Joint Committee on Transportation. So in thinking about who to outreach, who isn't your legislator, I would say it's a both and approach. So it's appropriate to contact your legislator and ask them to weigh in with the committee chairs to support your bill or advance the bill out of committee and other members of the committee. And it's also appropriate to reach out to the committee chairs directly with your experience. So I think that's an example of where like you can where it makes sense to reach out to legislators that are not necessarily representing your district. So we'll go back. We'll talk about this at length when we get to the legislative cycle and the process and opportunities to influence the outcomes. But for now, I'll leave it at this. And then I'll circle back because I want to make sure that I am really answering your question. And I think this also gets to the mobilization piece, which is also very, very important. All righty. I will pause here and see if there's anyone else that would like to share anything interesting about your legislator, about their bio, about any bills that they're working on with the group. And again, you can feel free to put them into the chat, or if you would like, just come off mute and share what you found with everyone. Alrighty, seeing no hands, I think this might be a good place to pause. So I really appreciate everyone taking the time to find sleuth a little bit on their legislators and seeing how the bills that they've sponsored and seeing which ones relate to the issues that you care about. This is going to be like really helpful in shaping your advocacy going forward. So I encourage y'all as you progress to return back to the legislature's website. It's a good place to find out not only if your legislators have supported a bill, co-sponsored a bill, but during the budget process, it kind of gives you an outline of where we are. In the budget process cycle, when you click on the individual bills, it'll also tell you which committee they're in and if there's a hearing and if it's progressed. Like, so it's a place that has all the centralized information about the different issues that you care about and where to find information on hearings. So definitely bookmark that page. It's going to be really helpful in your advocacy. And with that, I am going to pause here. We have another breakout activity planned, but gonna pause here and give folks about a 5-minute break. Stretch your legs, grab some water, grab a snack, do what you need to do. You can feel free to go off camera and we will come back together at 10:59 to talk about the budget, what it is, and then go into our next breakout activity. So I will see you all in 5 minutes. All right, y'all. So we're gonna jump back in. I encourage folks to turn your cameras back on if you feel comfortable. For folks that have their cameras off, if you can just give me a thumbs up if you're back at your computer and you're ready to go. I'm seeing a thumbs up from Chris. All right, I'm seeing thumbs up all around. Awesome, thank you all. So now we've talked a little bit about the who we should direct our advocacy to, who holds the levers of change within the legislature. And now we're going to talk about when. We're going to talk about how we as advocates can influence the process both on the legislative side and the state budget. So first, we're going to focus on the state budget because we are in the throes of the budget season and want to make sure that y'all are equipped with the tools that you need to influence the process. So before we jump into another breakout activity, I wanted to talk a little bit about the budget. So every year, as I mentioned earlier, the State House debates how our tax dollars will be allocated. For this reason, the budget is more than just a fiscal document. It's a declaration of our morals and our values as a Commonwealth. And we, the people, have the opportunity to influence the process and encourage legislators to either increase investments, prevent cuts, and strengthen programs that impact our communities. So we're going to spend some time familiarizing ourselves with the budget process in breakout groups. So in groups of, I think we have 13. So let's say groups of 2 to 3 will be in breakout rooms. And in your group, starting on slide 31, you'll work within your group to kind of arrange what you think the budget process looks like. So we'll have about 15 minutes in our small groups to talk about the budget process, to rearrange the order of the posted notes, and then we'll come back and then go get into the weeds of the budget process, talk about the order, as well as identify opportunities for advocates like you and I to raise our voice and influence the outcomes. So with that, I'll pause and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone. Awesome. It looks like everyone's back in the big room. As I was going around, I was very impressed. It feels like there are a lot of budget pros in this room, and loved to see the sequencing that all the different groups put together. So before I launch into the process, wanted to kind of respond in the large group to a question that I received in one of the smaller groups. So the question that I got was like, isn't there variability with the state budget process, like with the federal government and like with revenue? And I wanted to kind of lay that foundation with the group. So the state budget is something that happens annually, and it's one of the most predictable cycles in the legislature. The legislative session can be unpredictable in that like it's a lot of waiting around to know when there's going to be a hearing or a bill advances. But the budget, we know roughly when each section will drop. Like we know when the governor is going to drop her budget, when the House will do theirs and the Senate, and roughly by when the state budget needs to be finished by. However, the context is what changes, right? And during this budget cycle, there's a lot of uncertainty around the federal landscape, how the retraction of federal funding is going to impact the state, how retraction federal funding to like things like different schools to Medicaid, like how that is going to affect how funding is allocated in the state process. However, one thing that I will say is that here in Massachusetts, we have a huge rainy day fund. And the rainy day fund is essentially a savings account that the legislature tucks money away in case of emergency. Right now, and don't quote me on this, but I think it's roughly about $9 billion that we have in our rainy day fund for emergency. So we have a lot of money in that fund. And it is raining, right? It is pouring. We are in the middle of a crisis. And I think that's why it's even more important to be contacting our legislators to ensure that there are no huge gaps in state funding, to ensure that we use funds from the rainy day fund to continue to fund safety net programs and programs that are going to advance health equity and justice in the Commonwealth, to fund regional transit, to fund RAFT, MRVP, HIP, SNAP, all these programs that have a huge impact in our communities. So with that, I'm going to go through the budget process and also identify opportunities where we as advocates can influence the process. So in looking through people's post-it notes, a lot of folks got it right that before the governor drops her budget, there's conversations that happen at the end of the calendar year. So the governor and legislative leaders meet to talk about revenue estimates. And it's on these estimates that the governor will then create her proposal. And then as we get more updated revenue estimates, that'll then influence how much money each chamber has to play with, for example, like how much money they can devote based on those projections. So every year, the governor in January will release her proposal for the state budget. There is an opportunity really to advocate at this point, but it's helpful to know where the administration's priorities lie. So if you review the governor's budget and you see that your priority, for example, let's say Mass in Motion, which is a program that we at MPHA and the Department of Health really advocate for, is not in the governor's budget, then it shows that it's something that is not on their priority. So it's all the more reason why we need to get into the ear of the House and the Senate to really illustrate why it's so important that it's included in their budget proposals. So from there, and the bubble is a little bit incorrect because we're kind of like in between the two steps, but from there, the House Ways and Means will release their state budget. And we're actually expecting the House Ways and Means to release their budget proposal next Tuesday or Wednesday. So from January to beginning of April, that's when advocates from all across the state come together and create their letters, talk to legislators about what they want to see in the House budget. So we've had a lot of meetings with legislators, sent letters to the chairs of the House Ways and Means a committee and have met with like House and Senate leadership to really make our pitch on why things like SNAP, Mass in Motion, RAFT, MRVP, EA Shelter, and a myriad of programs need to be not only funded, but like need to be deeply invested in to meet the scale of need in the Commonwealth. From there, the House, after it releases their budget, then there's like a week-long period where if you don't see, well, it's a couple days. Let me retract that. If you don't see your priorities in the budget, then you work with legislative champions to file an amendment to make sure that your priority is added. So keeping on with the Mass in Motion example. So if House Ways and Means didn't include Mass in Motion in their original budget proposal, then we'll work with a representative, a legislative champion in the House, and ask them to file an amendment with the funding request that we're asking for, which is $300,000, and language for it to be included in the budget. Once it's filed as an amendment, then there's like a week-long period where it is like a mad dash, like where you we're trying to get in all representatives' ears, educate them on the importance of the program, why that money is important, what that money will be used for, and encourage them to co-sponsor the amendment. From there, the House will then debate. So in thinking about the amendments, thousands of amendments are filed to the state budget in this step. So that's why it's really important to be in your legislator's ear, follow up with them if they haven't co-sponsored and they say they will, to ensure there's a groundswell of support for your amendment. From there, representatives will then have a hearing and debate the amendments, and then you'll find out after a couple of days of hearings whether or not the amendment was filed, included in the final budget. After the debate, the House will then release their final budget proposal. If your amendment didn't get added, there's no need to sweat it. We have another bite at the apple with the Senate process. So essentially the Senate Ways and Means process mirrors and is identical to the House Ways and Means process. It's just like a couple weeks later. So we anticipate that in May, after the House completed theirs, the Senate will then release their budget proposal. And again, leading up to it, really important to be in the ear of the Ways and Means chairs, to be in the ear of your legislator and urging them to not only meet with the chairs, but to actively support your amendment. So it's one of their priorities and something that they're willing to go to bat for. Again, thousands of amendments are then filed, and then you repeat the process again. With the debates, the senators will debate the different amendments. They're grouped into different sections, focus on issue areas. So all amendments on housing will be debated at once. All issues on food access will be debated on at once, and like local public health and so on and so forth. And then from there, after the debate, the Senate will then release its version. Then we have a lot of versions in play, right? Like the Senate has theirs, the House has theirs. What do we do now? So from there, each chamber will then have representatives from their chamber that get put into a conference committee. The conference committee is then tasked with reconciling the differences between the different bills. And typically, the conference committee has until July 1st to pass their budget for the start of the new fiscal year. However, the legislature sometimes is not able to meet that deadline. So in those cases, the conference committee will continue to meet, but in order to keep the economy and the government going, they'll pass a 1/12 budget. So it's like a budget for a month to get them, to buy them time to keep having those negotiations, to keep kind of trying to resolve those differences between the House and the Senate budget. And yeah, to just give them time to have some of those conversations. So they can keep following a 1/12 budget for as long as they need to, in order to like come to an agreement. Once the conference committee has released its version, so it's a third version, a reconciled version between the House and the Senate, it will then go to the governor's desk for signature. And then the governor will have the opportunity to do some line item vetoes. So can pass the budget, but then can indicate different line items that either want to veto, cut out, or reduce for funding. So I'm trying to think of an example. I think last year, if not the year before, the majority of the budget was passed, but there were some vetoes that came back around local public health. We had asked for 15 million. It was what was put in both chambers, but then the governor vetoed and reduced that line item, I think, to 9.5. So at that time, we worked really hard with legislative advocates and with our coalition partners to put pressure on the legislature to come back and override the governor's veto. But given where we were in the legislative cycle, we were in informal session, we weren't able to override. So ultimately, the budget became law with those cuts. But once the final budget becomes law, then that is then implemented and then implemented for that fiscal year. So I'll pause here. I know that I talked a lot at you. And I'm seeing that there are some things in the chat. So I'm just going to open up the chat and see if there are any questions. All righty. I'm not seeing any new questions, but
I
I'll
have a
pause. Oh, Lori, yes, please feel free, jump in.
Could you please elaborate more on the conference committee and what it is exactly and how it's formed? What kind of pressure you can put on?
Yes. Yes, definitely. So the conference committee is typically comprised of senators and representatives. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head. I think it's 6 and 6. But the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the House and the chair of the Ways and Means Committee in the Senate will both be on the conference committee. And then from there, there's kind of like some uncertainty about who else will be on the committee. That's something that often takes a couple weeks to be released. And then once we have those names, like, so we know the Ways and Means chairs will definitely be on the committee. The other folks, there's a little bit of uncertainty. So once that's announced, there are a couple ways that we can influence the process. So oftentimes what we've done, and it's so different every year, because we kind of adapt and try and see what works best. But some of the things that we've done is send a letter to the conference committee about our priorities and then urging them to, for example, if the House gave local public health 15 million and the Senate gave local public health 10, then in our conference committee letter, we'll request that the conference committee go with the higher number. So like your advocacy looks a little bit different in that you're looking at both the House budget and the Senate budget and seeing which one you like best or which one includes the language that you want to see. And then you ask the conference committee to include that in the final budget proposal. So you can do that through a letter. Mobilization is also key. Oftentimes we'll see if we have any coalition partners that are within the districts of the conference committee members, because it is most effective to have constituents reaching out to their legislators on the committee. And then we'll also do kind of like a mass mobilization and ask folks to be reaching out to the chairs and the committee members by either phone or email, just to let them know which priorities, which version of the line item investment we're hoping to see. So it's kind of like a 3-prong approach, and you can take a menu of options. Does that answer your question, Lori?
Well, are they appointed or do they volunteer? Couldn't it be very lopsided and biased against your issue?
It can be. They are appointed, so they're not necessarily volunteered, but leadership in both the House and the Senate will will choose who gets to be in those committees. And that's why it's important throughout the process to be building relationships with their legislators and then helping to kind of do a power map of who in your orbit or who in your let me go back. Power map to see who's close to your legislator, and then think about the messenger. So if your legislator is close to someone on the committee, then really pushing on them to be an advocate and urge the committee to go with the higher or better language. It's also important to take note of within your coalition or within your movement, who holds some of those relationships, because going in person to your legislator and that's on the committee and making the case can also be really important. And then, I think more generally sending a letter with that education piece about why this issue is so urgent and why we need X amount of funding for it.
Are the conference committees the same categories of committees from year to year, or looking at the PFAS, is it PFAS falls under several categories? It's sort of health, it's sort of environmental. So how do you know who to approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. So going back to your first question, the conference committee for the state budget is different from year to year. Oftentimes there can be some continuity. So the chairs are often the same. So Chair Rodrigues in the Senate, Chair Michaelwitz in the House, they're still chairs of the Ways and Means Committee in their respective chambers. So we can assume that they will be in the conference committee. But then the other players, there's a little bit more uncertainty about who will be in those committees. So it's kind of a waiting game. At this time, there's a lot of advocacy groups and organizations that are in the state house gathering intel. We'll share about who we're hearing, the rumors about so-and-so, but we won't know with certainty until they're appointed. And that will be public and on the legislature's website. So then you can see who they are and which districts they represent. But I think in terms of your second question about PFAS and which bucket it will lie in, so that'll come into play when the different amendments are being characterized for the different debates. And the House and the Senate all do it a little bit differently. So it might be that PFAS is a PFAS amendment is characterized as local public health in the House, and then it's characterized as miscellaneous in the Senate. But it's really important to know the amendment number and the filer, and that'll make it easier to find. So the category really isn't that important. It's helpful in knowing when it'll be taken up, because sometimes during debate, the House and the Senate will say that they're going to take up housing and miscellaneous. So that day, that session, that your amendment will be heard, and then there'll be a debate about it. So you have a rough estimate of when you expect to kind of know the outcome of the debate and know if it will advance in the budget process.
Okay.
Does that answer your question, Lori?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, so I see a question from Chris. What about mass insurance for people with disabilities?
Elaborate on that if you.
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to find out within the bubbles here for people with, because I know insurances are looking, but it's I see cuts here and there.
Mm-hmm.
So it's what do we do as people with disabilities to make sure that we get the right services? Not sure if that's a question that can be answered here or somewhere else. I don't know if that's, if it's related into what we're talking about.
That's a good question, Chris. And within that, I hear two questions. So the first being, how do I know like if there are cuts to programs for people with disabilities in the budget? And two, how to influence the process. So I'm going to start with two. I think there are a lot of great coalitions that are like doing the watchdogging of like what's in the state budget. And it's important to stay connected with them so that you have a heads up of when things are coming and also the ask, because we want to make sure that when we are organizing, we're mobilizing our constituents, our neighbors, our family members, anyone like our work colleagues, like we're all asking for the same thing, and that they're hearing the same message from their constituents. So getting plugged in with a coalition or an organization is a really helpful way to kind of stay in the loop. So Disability Policy Consortium is a great organization, and also BCIL, the Boston Center for Independent Living. They do a lot of watchdogging of the state budget as well, and they're close partners of ours. And they're monitoring the state budget, will analyze the budget when it drops. So it's the onus isn't on individuals or constituents to read the budget and figure out what's in it and what's not. So it's helpful for that analysis and also like the crafting of the ask. And then to your first question about where do we find that information, I think plugging in with organizations is helpful, but you can find that information on your own. And I am going to toggle to the legislature's website. To find out where we are on the state budget process, you can toggle to budget and they have this like cute little timeline that tells you where we are. So right now, only the governor's budget has been released, but when House Ways and Means releases their budget, you can click that tab and that's where the budget, their proposal will be. Once amendments are filed, you can find the amendments under the debate tab. And then it will repeat the process for the Senate. But looking at the budget, you can click on the budget proposal. All right.
Thank you, Victoria.
And then scrolling through, if you know the specific line item that you're looking for, what I do, I control find is a lifesaver for the budget, especially if you have specific line items that you're looking for. So I'm just gonna say here, public regional transit, because I know that is in here. And like this is the regional transit line item. So you can see that they're allocating, the governor's proposing 204 million.
Yep.
And then if you read the line item language, it'll include like what, like the stipulations. Sometimes there are earmarks for specific programs within a budget line item. So all this information is really helpful. So that's how you can kind of find all the information on the budget itself. But again, I encourage folks to really plug in with coalitions or organizations that are doing the work so that it doesn't feel as overwhelming and that you have an analysis of what's in, what's not, and how to plug in. It really helps to simplify the advocacy process.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Chris?
Overall, yes.
Okay.
Because I just recently started with the Spina Bifida Association of Greater New England. I just started at an advocacy piece through there. So I'm hooked in with them a little bit. But I just was trying to figure out more of a questions pertaining to people with disabilities, how they can really help to advocate what we need. Because I know there are a lot of people out there that can claim they're disabled, but they would take advantage of the funds that the ones that really need it. That's what I was asking about.
Yeah, I hear you. I
But
think
then-
in
but-
thinking about,
different time, Jen, just you and I, if that makes sense. We can,
yeah, definitely. I'm always happy to connect offline. Again, I think plugging into those organizations, so I can toward the end find the website and like the email sign up for the Disability Policy Consortium of Massachusetts, for BCIL, and there are other like independent living associations in the state and also New England that are doing a lot of that advocacy, both at the state budget level and the legislative level, around bills. And they'll have information about just like other coalitions, like about what we're seeing, what we're not seeing, what we need, and then opportunities to customize templates like emails and phone scripts to then reach out to our legislators. And I think a piece that you're tapping into is like, once we know what's in the budget, once we know what we need, what do we do with those pieces?
right,
That's something that we're going to get to in a little bit, to think about how do we put all those pieces together so that we are making an effective ask and are crafting it in a way that's compelling and really gets at the head and the heart, so that we can get legislators to become advocates for our priorities. So we will touch more on that later on, but
yeah, I wasn't sure if this particular slide area was the right place to ask that question, or if it was further down the line. That's why.
okay. So yeah, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Yeah, we will get to that in a little bit. But again, and I've said this to a couple of folks in the breakout groups, I will put my email at the end. If you ever have questions, want to talk through something, I'm always happy to be a resource. And if I don't know the answer, then I'm happy to connect you to someone that does. But I'll put my contact information in the chat shortly.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
Cool.
I'm sorry, folks.
No, these are all really great questions. Appreciate you raising them. And yeah, I appreciate you raising them. And then we're going to use this as a foundation to like cultivate a compelling message. Before we move on, I'm going to pause here and see if there's any last minute burning questions before we take a kind of bird's eye view of the legislative calendar. Alrighty. Seeing none, I'm going to move on to our next slide. I'm going to quickly go through how a bill becomes a law. Oftentimes, we like to start off with the budget cycle because it is something concrete and predictable. We know the ebbs and flows, so it makes it easier to understand. The legislative process, while we have some idea of when things will happen, can be a little bit unpredictable. So getting a firm grasp of the budget process lays a good foundation for understanding the legislative process. So just quickly, as I mentioned earlier in the training, in Massachusetts, we're fortunate that we have a 2-year legislative cycle and our legislators meet year round. So that means that we have opportunity all year to contact our legislators, to be building relationships, to tell them about the issues in the community and also the solutions that we want to see implemented. The legislative cycle started this past January, so we're in year 1 of the 2-year cycle. So in January, I think it's like 6,500 bills were filed. And then from there, coalitions start like our big advocacy push to get co-sponsors to sign on in support of bills. So when we were on the different legislator pages, the co-sponsored tab is what we saw, like in terms of like bills that they've co-sponsored that they have not filed themselves, but they support. From there, House and Senate leadership, they work to then appoint people, well, different legislators to chair the different committees. Once the joint committee assignments are out there, then bills are then sent to the different committees, and the committee chairs decide in what order they'll hear bills and when bills will be heard. From there, there'll be a hearing. That's a great opportunity for people to plug in, submit testimony to the committee, telling them why it's so important, and like why they need to take action, and urging them to advance the bill through the legislative process. From there, there's a deadline by which a committee needs to take action, and they can take 3 different types of action. So they can vote the bill to pass, meaning that it'll advance to the next committee. Vote the bill ought not to pass, which means that that's the end of the road for the bill this session. That often doesn't happen because the legislature is very polite and they don't like to kill a bill like outright. So oftentimes they'll take a third option, which is vote the bill like to go to study. So which is a very fancy and elaborate way to say that the bill is not moving this session, come back later, like refile next year. And then from there, like bills, the number of bills keeps narrowing and narrowing. They'll go to another committee. From there, they'll go to a third committee, often making their way through the Ways and Means Committee. And then from there, it'll go to a floor vote. And then we'll repeat the process in the next chamber. So it'll go, if it started in the House and it was passed, then the bill will then go to the Senate, go through the process of debate, making any changes, and then the Senate will vote whether or not to pass a bill. Once it's passed in both chambers, we'll then go to a conference committee to reconcile the differences between the 2 bills, if there is any, similar to what we do in the budget. And for this, senators and representatives are appointed to that committee to reconcile the differences. Once the conference committee has their final version, then it'll go to the governor's desk to be signed. The governor has a couple options that she can take. She can sign the bill into law. She can veto it. She can return it back with amendments. And then for the veto and the amendments, the legislature has the opportunity to override the governor's veto or amendments with a 2/3 majority, meaning that we need 2/3 of the House and Senate to come together and say, nope, we want to pass it as is. We reject your amendments and we need to make it into law, in which case it'll then go back to the governor and it becomes law. And throughout the process, there is a lot of opportunity for advocates to influence the outcome. So when things are being heard in different public hearings, that's a great opportunity for advocates to raise their voice, urge the legislature to, or the committee to advance a bill. After a hearing, following up with them, getting them new information, and talking with your legislator and really priming them to be an advocate for your issue, and then go to the respective committee and urge them to advance the bill. When there's floor debate, there is also opportunity, again, going to your legislator and priming them with the talking points, and urging them to be an advocate and to urge their colleagues in either chamber to vote in support of passage of the bill. In the conference committee, there's also opportunity as well, similar to the budget, to urge, if there's a particular language in one bill that's not included in the other chamber's version, urging them to go with the version that is stronger and explaining why in that process. So there are a lot of similarities between the state budget and the legislative process. It's just that the legislative process is happening over an extended period of time, over 2 years. So because of that, like, it makes, like, we know when the windows of opportunity will be, but there's more uncertainty of when things will happen. So for example, now joint committees have been appointed, bills have been assigned to committee, and now we're kind of like in this stage where we're just waiting for joint committees to announce when they're going to be hearing different bills and different legislation, so that we can mobilize our partners to testify in front of the committee about the bill and why it needs to pass. So like right now we're in that holding period. We know that we have opportunity to take action, but are just waiting for things to be assigned. So I'll pause here and see if folks have any questions. Lori.
Of course, I have a question. I'm getting confused over if we want, for example, pass a PFAS bill. There is one that was not brought to the floor last year. Needs a certain amount of money to support it. So does the bill get passed first and then the next year money gets allocated in the budget for that bill, or does it happen at the same time? I'm confused.
That's a good question. So the state budget and the legislative process are happening concurrently. So sometimes we have multiple bites at the apple. So in thinking about PFAS, sometimes depending on the political calculus, a coalition might choose to, in the budget, ask the legislature to both establish a program and invest money in it. So that's like a way to kind of circumvent the legislative process and try and get it done quicker through the state budget. So that's one way. The bill will continue to move independently. So sometimes, let's say, if the state budget process, if the amendment in the state budget doesn't go through in that like state budget cycle, then there's still opportunity for the bill to keep progressing. It might be that the language or the program is passed, but that money is not. So then that becomes a fight for next year. An example of that is with the Mass Healthy Homes program. So the Mass Healthy Homes program is a remediation program that really focuses on large cities to do lead remediation, mold, pest control, and creates a fund. That bill did not move independently. However, it was attached to the Affordable Homes Act, and the program was codified. However, the legislature did not put any money into the fund. So we got a win, but we didn't get the money to implement the program, which is like a huge bummer, right? But like at least we got our foot in the door. So now this budget cycle, the Mass Healthy Homes Program Coalition and a coalition of partners are working to get an amendment, well, to urge the House and the Senate to include it in their budget proposal. If it's not included, working with champions to file an amendment to fund the program so that we can start implementing the program and start making an impact. Because right now it's in law, but we don't really have, there's no money to make it happen.
So they wouldn't be required to create a budget if it passed?
No, they're not required. Which is like can be the unfortunate thing. Oftentimes, like we want to get two things done, right? We want the program either codified into law, started, and the money. And that's like an ideal scenario. This is an unusual situation in which the legislature gave us a win on one end, but didn't give us the money to implement the program. So it's like starting to like build off the momentum of the passage of the language and then trying to make the case for why investments are so critical now and why we need to put money in this state budget process to get the program off the ground.
Do they hold placeholders sometimes in the budget? So they're waiting for the bill to be passed and they're putting X amount of dollars into the budget, hoping it'll pass?
No, so the budget, legislators will only allocate money to programs that are in the budget. So there won't be any placeholders for it. However, like going back to the advocacy piece, like sometimes coalitions will like file a bill and also try and get the program or language in the state budget.
Okay.
So did I answer your question, Lori?
Yeah, it's still confusing about the reality of following through, but I'm starting to understand. It's okay. So our issue did not make it to the floor last time. So I'm assuming we must have been between year 6 and 7.
Yeah, so it didn't make it to the floor. So that means like its journey was cut short somewhere between the committees, is what often that means, that it didn't come out of committee
Yeah.
and was passed on to the next. Another thing that I will add is that like making a bill become law is a very incremental process. It's a long process. One of our hallmark bills, SAFE 2.0, which is statewide accelerated public health for every community, recently passed after 2 legislative sessions advocating, and we came so close every year. One year it made it to the governor's desk. Governor Baker sent it back with the poison pill veto, and because we were in formal session, the legislature could not come back to override, so we were effectively donezo. And we've tried to move pieces in the budget and in other places. But, after 4 years of fighting, it finally became law. So one of the things that we focus on is really celebrating the wins along the way. Like the ultimate goal, yes, is to pass the bill, but let's say second time around, you got more co-sponsors, you're able to turn out more people to testify, and you got a little bit further in the process. That's a big win. And that's something that should be celebrated because it takes a lot to mobilize, right? And seeing those numbers grow, it's like it's trending in the right direction and helping build the support and the foundation needed to get across the finish line. Another example is the driver's license bill that took 17 years to pass, and it finally did, right? So I think legislation making a bill become law can be, you see incremental wins along the way, but they're all building toward the final product of having it become law. Any other, of course, any other questions from the group? Feel free to either come off mute or put things into the chat. All righty, seeing none, I think we can move right along. All right, legislative engagement. We talked about the who. We talked about when there are windows of opportunity. Now let's talk about how. Earlier, I mentioned that we in Massachusetts are very fortunate in that we have the opportunity to meet with our legislators and build relationships all year round in the 2-year cycle. So we have a lot of access to our elected officials. So now we're going to talk about identifying the right person, meaning who in addition, sorry, to your legislators you should be reaching out to. And we talked a little bit about the who depends on where we are in the process, right? So in the beginning, for a co-sponsor push, really reaching out to your legislator. When there's a joint committee hearing, that's reaching out to your legislator and the committee chairs about the issue, your support and why it needs to move forward, and how those targets look different at each stage of the legislative cycle or the state budget cycle. All right, so now I feel like I primed everyone for this, and I might have given you the answer. It didn't look ahead, but question to y'all, feel free to either come off mute, put things in the chat. When should advocates engage with legislators? I'd love to hear a few thoughts.
Immediately.
Yes. All together now, all year round. We have opportunity all year round to engage with our legislators. And again, how that advocacy looks like depends on which part of the process we're in. And then just a couple tips for like how to engage with your legislators. And a lot of these are pretty straightforward, but we have some do's and don'ts. A thing to remember is that legislators are just people. One thing that I like when I first started, I was so nervous to talk to legislators. Like I built them up in my head and they kind of felt like celebrities. So I was like very intimidated talking with them. But you have to remember that legislators are generalists. They are not experts. You are the expert on your community. on the issues, on the solutions. So they need to be hearing from you. And it's really important that if you are contacting a legislator and you are in their district, that you tell them that you're a constituent, because again, legislators work for us, they work for you, and we have the power. When meeting with legislators, it's important to lead with your experience and your expertise, to be polite, friendly, and patient. Oftentimes, legislators have a brief window where they can meet. Some legislators are lovely and just want to catch up and want to see how you're doing. However, that cuts into the time that you have to, get into the issue and share your talking points. So it's good to be concise and to the point. And remember to make your conversation, your interaction with them personal, and to offer a story if you're going to also do data to kind of get at the head and the heart. And we'll talk more about that formula, what it looks like later on. And be prepared to talk to staff people who work with your elected official. Sometimes when we go to the State House, we pop by a legislator's office and there's a staff person there, and talking with them, building a relationship with them is also really important. Again, legislators are generalists, so oftentimes they're receiving their information and it's being triaged by staff. So being kind, respectful to staff is really, really important. A couple don'ts. Don't assume that someone else is contacting your legislator about the issue. And like as a reason for not reaching out. I think that's really important. And even if there are other people reaching out about the same issue, I think that then more people are reaching out about the same thing in their districts, then the more urgency they're going to have in having that issue or policy become one of their priorities, because they're hearing a lot about it from their constituents. And don't be intimidated. I know that that's easier said than done. But again, legislators are just people like you and I. They're in the community at soccer games, at local businesses, and we shouldn't be intimidated. And don't exaggerate or be dishonest. And honestly, don't be afraid to say you don't know, right? I think one of the things that can be scary about approaching legislators is that we feel like we're not experts on the policy, like we're not a policy wonk and we don't know the ins and outs. And that's completely okay. I think it's not your job to be the policy wonk. There are other organizations that are leading the charge that have materials and have fact sheets that you can follow up. So if someone asks, if a legislator or staff person asks you a question and you don't know the answer, it's perfectly fine to say, I can find that out for you and we'll follow up. And that's good in that, like, you create another touch point and then you follow up with the information that they need, and just creates another opportunity to continue building that relationship with the legislator. And lastly, don't forget your power. We as constituents have a ton of power. We vote electeds in and out of office. And when we come together and speak in a unified voice, our voice cannot be ignored. So never forget your power. All right, Paula?
Hey, Janeska. So I think this is a good time to bring up some questions from the chat. And then I have a question for you as well.
Sure.
So Denise writes, not sure if this is coming up in the presentation, but at some point, could you speak to the pros and cons of contacting your legislator specifically versus another legislator who you know is already passionate about the issues that you're working on? And then conversely, Lori asks, what about contacting someone who is not your elected official, but whom you want to push to support? Does that have no impact? Do you really need to find supporters within that district?
Yeah, so all great questions. And let me go back to Denise's. So I think it's really important to build a relationship with your legislator, and build that relationship so that like when they think of experts or who they need to go to, it's your face that they think of and will come to you with questions. So it's really important to develop that throughout the legislative process. In terms of reaching out to another legislator that's not your legislator, that depends on where we are in the legislative process or the state budget process. So for the state budget, it's always like a both and, like you want to be contacting your legislator with your ask and urging them to be an advocate for members of the committee. So in the state budget, you know, reaching out to the House Ways and Means Committee chairs about your issue areas and your priorities. When legislation is going through the process, it's really important to also contact the chairs of the joint committee. So one thing that I can do is show you how to find that information. So I showed you how to find your legislator. Now to find the different committees and committee chairs, you can toggle to the legislature's website and go on this tab, committees and commissions. I'm going to click on all committees just to show you the variety of committees that are in existence. And let's go to all the way to the bottom, Ways and Means, Joint Ways and Means. So when you click on Joint Ways and Means, it'll tell you who the Senate members are, who the House members are. So the chair in the Senate is Michael Rodrigues. Chair in the House is Erin Michaelwitz. And then I'll have all the different members. And then you can toggle and see if your legislator is on that list. And if not, I think directing advocacy to the chair and the vice chair. If you know people that live in the chair or vice chair's districts, getting them to contact the chair or vice chair directly is really important, or mobilizing people that are in any of these legislators' district is also very important as well. So that's a situation in which it's helpful to reach out to your legislator and a legislator that's on a committee where your budget priority or your legislation is being considered. So I'll pause there. Does that answer your question, Denise and Lori?
I have. Sorry, I keep asking questions.
No. This is a great space. I want questions. This is a great conversation.
Connecting to your constituent these days can consist of email, mail, phone call, visit. Are some of them more powerful, more useful? Obviously, visiting in person is probably best, but least easy to do, hardest to do. So, and then you hear about like advocacy days or legislation days where you get a bunch of people to go in and speak to people on the same issue on the same day. What's the best use of time and most powerful?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it depends again on the time of year and also your capacity. If you live in Western Mass and it's really impossible to get to the State House, then meeting with your legislators in their in-district office is a way that you can kind of see them in person and have that FaceTime in a way that's more like accessible. Phone calls are always great. You can always leave a voicemail if no one answers or speak to a staffer. And I would say phone is often more impactful than email because you're ensuring that your message is being received. Whereas email, it's a little harder to see if they've read it or not. But I think following up, if you email and don't get a response, don't be afraid to circle back with the same email or bring to the top of a legislator's or staffer's inbox. That's, advocacy is following up. It's circling back with the information with your ask and making sure that, they can confirm receipt, or if they have any questions, they can get back to you.
Thank you.
And advocacy days are really important. It's an opportunity to really highlight an issue in the State House and have some of that face-to-face time at the State House offices with other coalition members and advocates. But again, if that's not accessible to you, or you live in a part that's like geographically disconnected, or you just have no way of getting to the State House, then there are ways to kind of plug in a way that's like concurrent with what's happening in the State House. So if you know an advocacy day is happening, you're not able to attend in person, making calls that day or sending emails that day also go a very long way, and as a way to kind of feel like part of the action on a particular issue without having to be there in person. And more advocacy days at least some of the programming when there are speeches and legislators coming tend to have a hybrid option where you can tune in to, to the programming, or even like you can schedule, if you know the advocacy day well enough in advance, a Zoom meeting with your legislator on that day at some point. So it's building off of the energy and movement in the State House.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Alrighty, any other questions?
Yep, just a quick last minute question. Can you talk about how many phone calls or emails or outreach? How much of each, if that makes a difference,
How much of it?
does it take to get something passed on to your legislator?
That's a good question. I think it depends on the legislator. And it depends on like the foundation that you've been able to kind of put in place with that legislator and like how strong the relationship is. I oftentimes during the busy season, so like advocacy is going to be ramping up for the budget and budget amendments. So oftentimes it's difficult to get in touch with a legislator and their staffer during this time, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try. So if you've called a couple times and it goes to voicemail, leave a voicemail, and then follow up again in writing to say that you've called, you wanted to follow up and provide the information, and to circle back. Oftentimes, in my experience, there are a lot of legislators that like really value constituents reaching out to them and have will reply to say like, heard, like, thank you for reaching out, analyzing this, and we'll get back with any questions, to acknowledge receipt, which can be very helpful and can create a little bit of a buffer, not a buffer, but like some downtime where you can then circle back later on, and don't need to do it so frequently. So I think that's what I would say. Does that answer your question, Bala?
Thank you.
Alrighty. So moving right, well, I'll pause here. Any other final questions before we move on? All right. All right. So moving on to telling your story and the secret ingredients that go into compelling messaging. Like I've said, legislators are generalists and legislators are decision makers. They want to hear about the solution to your problem so that they can decide whether to offer their support. So data is really important and it can be useful in explaining the severity of an issue, but stories tend to be stickier. Legislators are human beings at the end of the day, and it's really important to get at both the head and the heart when you're crafting your testimony or your messaging, or preparing to meet with the legislator. So it's important to link your issue to a clear ask as well. So stories and data is helpful, but if you don't connect that to the ask, then a legislator might not know like what action to take in response to the information that you shared. So it's really important to have a clear ask. So for example, if you're talking to a legislator and there's going to be a vote coming up, you can ask them to support X bill and vote yes or no on a certain issue. You can also anchor your ask with powerful stories and data. The combination of both is like the best, and it's like a 1-2 punch that helps make your messaging really effective. So in thinking about an example, if I were to meet with the legislator to discuss the RTA advancement bill, I might say that 40% of regional transit authorities are unable to offer 7 days a week service. I might anchor this fact or this data point with a story about how someone in my community who needed to get service, to need to get groceries or an appointment or get to work after service hours, how they struggled to and how to get to and from point A and point B, as the story. And then I might ask them to depending on where we are in the legislative session, to co-sponsor, to support the RTA advancement bill, and then describe very quickly what the bill would do. So I'm getting at the head and the heart with the data point, with the story, and then I have a clear ask of what I want the legislator to do. So I'll pause here and see if folks have any questions about that breakdown. So we broke it up into like a formula. So step one, share what the problem is and emphasize the solution. Step two, share why the legislator should care using stories and data. And then the final step is share a clear ask about how they can support. Welcome back. Welcome back, folks. I think folks are still trickling in from the breakout groups. We're just going to give them another 10 seconds or so. I think we might be waiting on one.
I'm back.
Okay, Chris, I see you, Lori, Jackie. All right, I think this is everyone. So I'd love to hear how that exercise went. Are there any reflections from the role-playing exercise, or if someone feels so inspired about like their talking points? I'd love to hear some of the messaging and how you structured your issue. Any volunteers who want to share some of their messaging, or yeah, just any thoughts from the breakout?
It was great to have to verbalize what's in your head and just practice.
Yeah, it's a good exercise, and it's something that we don't often do, but like I feel like going through the motions helps to build confidence.
Yes.
And also helps to demystify the process, right? Like once you start going and you start thinking about how you structure it, it doesn't feel as scary, right? You're just having a conversation. It's just a way to organize your thoughts.
Definitely.
Alrighty. Any other thoughts or volunteers who want to share what they shared in their breakout group?
I can see how telling a story would definitely help highlight the issue and make it more personal and memorable. Memorable.
Yeah, definitely. I think too, like when legislators have stories in addition to data, then like that sticks in their brain in a way that data can't do alone. And oftentimes when we've structured it in that way, like we've heard legislators then repeating or sharing the story that we've shared with them. So it's also a good way to equip legislators with the talking points that they need to be an effective messenger on behalf of your issue area.
Yeah.
Thank you all for sharing your thoughts and for going through the exercise. I think this is a really good equation for thinking about how to structure your talking points regardless of who you're speaking to in government, right? This is effective for city councilors. This is effective for your state legislators as well as the federal delegation. It's just like, yeah, that combination of data, stories, and ask that make it very easy for legislators to make that a quick assessment about how they can support. So I would file this for later. I use this often in my advocacy, both personally and professionally, and found that it's a simplified way to kind of break down complex issues. Alrighty. So from there, just wanted to give a quick overview of the RTA budget campaign and how the RTA budget campaign put some of the skills and the tactics that we mentioned previously into action to advocate for historic investments in regional transit. So the problem that the coalition and the campaign faced was that community health was being impacted by limited RTA service. Oftentimes, transit didn't run frequently enough. It didn't run into the evenings, didn't run daily, and oftentimes didn't run on the weekend. And we know that life doesn't end like after 9 to 5, Monday to Friday, that we need opportunities and ways to connect to our friends, social connections, jobs, education. So some of the tactics that the advocacy campaign employed was convening nonprofits and different community groups during regular meetings and regional events. And this helped to really create a space for people to share stories, and have a way to centralize some of those stories, as well as give like regional flair or regional perspective to the issue, convening legislators regionally, help them focus on their specific RTA and make connections to the different asks, as well as give opportunity for community members to like have some face time with legislators. Developed a messaging and communications tool. We had really effective messaging that often was repeated back to us. So the messaging was that RTAs serve more than 50% of the Massachusetts population, but only receive 7% of state funding. And that was something that when connected to stories was really impactful. And we often heard legislators reciting that same talking point to us and in public hearings, which was great because that's how you know your communication is effective and is being received. We also organized members around the legislative process and made it clear when there were opportunities to plug in and how. So as a result of all of these tactics, we were able to engage and create a statewide network of cross-sectoral organizations to show that this isn't just a transit issue. It's a food justice issue. It's an economic mobility issue. It's a disability issue. It's a healthy food access issue. And having all these different perspectives helped to show why RTA was so, like, investment in regional transit and public transit is so important. Because of that, we were able to capture the attention of public decision makers, do a public education campaign, and have them make it their priority. So because of that, we were able to increase our levels of funding to support RTA communities. And through that, with increased funding in the budget, we've been able to see that RTs all across the state are now expanding services. They go later into the evening. They're, having services on the weekend. They're hiring more bus drivers at full-time pay to be able to add more routes. And that will only keep improving and getting better as long as we're able to sustain and build upon these investments, right? We can't go back. So that's why, even though we got these wins, it's important to continue pushing and advocating for why these investments or why transit is so important. So just wanted to offer just an example of what a past campaign has looked like around the state budget. All right, so I'll pause here. We're going to shift gears a little bit. And we're now in the final stretch of our training. And this is going to be focused on lobbying and advocacy and questions around whether or not you can do it. And I will say, I'm not a lawyer, so this is not legal advice. These are just some guidelines. And if you have any specific questions about like the legality of whether or not you can lobby because of where you sit in your organization, it's always best to go back to your org and get input there. All right. So why advocate and lobby? As I said, everyone together now. Legislators are generalists. They want to hear from you. They need your eyes and your ears to know what's coming up in the community and the solutions. Advocating and lobbying, it impacts who gets what, when, and how. So it impacts what programs or initiatives get funded, which ones get cut, which ones get expanded, or which bills get passed. It also creates an opportunity to create dialogue about a certain issue, to like humanize data, because oftentimes legislators want data, but in those numbers, they forget that they're seeing people. So it creates an opportunity to educate, and also an opportunity for legislators to ask questions and become more informed on an issue as well as a solution. And it's also important to advocate because it impacts health. All of these different policy issues, programs, they all impact the public's health and community health. So it's all the more reason why it's important to tap in and contact your legislators and do it routinely. All right, so what is lobbying? So there are two different types of lobbying. There's direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying. Direct lobbying follows this equation. So you're getting in contact with your elected official or their staffer about a specific piece of legislation, and you want them to take a specific piece, like specific action. So you're getting in touch with them about the RTA bill and you're wanting them to co-sponsor. Grassroots lobbying is more so directed at like your base or your coalition. So, and it follows this equation. So you're communicating with people, your networks, your family, your friends, you're expressing a certain view on an issue or legislation, and then you're urging the people in your network to contact their legislators. So you're not approaching a legislator directly in this example, but rather you're mobilizing. So the big difference between direct lobbying and grassroots lobbying is that direct lobbying involves a clear and direct ask to a legislator or their staffer. And grassroots lobbying is you're trying to mobilize your base to take action on a specific issue and contact their legislator. So that's the big kind of distinction. All right, so now we're gonna rapid fire through a couple examples. I'm gonna read the example and then feel free to either come off mute or put it in the chat, but would love for folks to say if it's advocacy or if it's lobbying. So sending a mass email to a listserv asking your subscribers to contact their legislators about co-sponsoring a bill that protects low-income folks from eviction. Is that lobbying or advocacy?
Advocacy.
All right, Lori saying advocacy. Any other thoughts?
See as well.
Advocacy? Okay. This is a tricky one because it is advocacy. However, there is an ask. So sending an email to a listserv is your base, and you're asking them to take an action and contact their legislator to co-sponsor a bill. So thinking about the formula that we just went through, it's communication of people with a clear action on a specific bill. So that's grassroots lobbying. Advocacy is more education about an issue. So I'm not gonna get ahead because I'm gonna then give you all the answer for the next one, but I'm gonna jump into the next example and then we can again kind of talk about advocacy versus lobbying. All right, number 2, organizing an educational public forum for local politicians to debate and share their views on transportation issues. Would that be advocacy or lobbying?
That's advocacy.
Yes. And can you say why, Lori?
Because you're educating people and hearing the opinions of different politicians, local people.
Absolutely. And the big thing here is that you're educating about an issue, but there is no ask involved. So it's just advocacy, just education. And maybe let's do one more because I'm looking at the clock and we're running out of time. So number 3, speaking with the legislator about how the farmers market incentive program has impacted the community. Is that advocacy or lobbying?
I want to say advocacy.
That's right. Because you're talking to them about a specific program, but there's no ask. And then last one, calling or writing a member of your legislature, asking them to vote against the current version of a climate bill. Is that advocacy or lobbying?
Lobbying.
Lobbying.
I mean, y'all are pros. That's exactly right. It's direct lobbying because you're reaching out and want them to take a specific action, and you're talking to the legislator directly. So y'all have this down. Just quickly, how and when can you lobby? So we all have a responsibility to lobby and to be influencing the programs and bills that are passed that impact community health, the public's health, our neighborhoods and our neighbors. Most of you will never hit the threshold that would jeopardize either your 501c3 status or require you to register as a lobbyist. I think that is like 25 hours per 6-month period. Oftentimes I don't hit that. So, which is reassuring to y'all, like talking to your legislators, you won't often be in such routine conversation or with them, that you'll hit that threshold. And it's also, again, to that point, important to distinguish between when you're educating and like around advocacy and when you have a direct ask. And only direct lobbying is what counts toward that total.
Did you say 25 hours?
Per 6-month period, I believe.
Oh,
Don't quote me on that. It might be 20 to 25.
okay.
And then lastly, if you work for the government, you are legally able to lobby, but you might want to check with your organization to understand your own organizational policies around when you can lobby, when you can speak on behalf of your organization. All right. And lastly, when thinking about what's next, what's coming down the pipeline, you are not alone. As I've mentioned, there are a ton of organizations that work full-time on campaigns that matter to you. They analyze bills, they analyze the state budget, they build coalitions, and they'll keep you in the know about how and when you can take action to influence legislators. So I've included a couple examples here. It's not an extensive or exhaustive list, but these are some of the partners that we work with. And it's always great to connect with them, get on their listserv so that you know when there are windows of opportunity to take action. Alrighty, and then here's my contact information. I'll put that in the chat. And I encourage y'all, if you want to stay connected with MPHA, MPHA is also an organization that keeps people abreast of the issues and opportunities for action. So if you're interested and want to be kept in the loop about our policy priorities, our budget priorities, and how you can make a difference and raise your voice, I encourage y'all to sign up for our newsletter so you can get all those real-time updates in your inbox. All right, and with that, coming just under the wire, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and see if folks have any questions before we click off for the day.